said it so much better than anything I could ever have said. And the fact that it covers all the ground and it brings it all together, it gives a much better picture of what it is to be trans in certainly the UK today, and why our politicians and our journalists and everyone who wants to debate us should read and digest and understand a lot better. I think it's an excellent book, it's a brilliant book, and thank you, Shon, for writing it. So we're just going to have a little natter here, and then you'll have a chance to ask some questions, and Shon will do the best to give just as good answers as the book. I want to start by, that's why I didn't want to hold the mic, I wanted two hands free. But I just want to read the conclusion, first paragraph, because I think this is really important. There can be no trans liberation under capitalism. This is a fact. Yet it's not a popular view among liberal and centrist LGBTQ+ advocacy groups who, as we've seen in the course of this book, talk about trans rights in isolation as a range of personal freedoms and protections, and to cling to corporations and brands as potential allies in the fight for social acceptance. So how can true justice be achieved? And I was impressed by that because it brought me up sharp. I used to talk, Shon, about wanting rights and wanting equality. And then I read this and I thought, why am I not saying justice? So can you say a bit about how, in your mind, you've moved from your own self-understanding through transition to a book that is an argument for justice?
Okay, cool. Big question. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming along as well, I should say at the beginning. Thinking about, that's comes at the very end of the book, as I'm kind of trying to round things off and just throw in, there can be no liberation under capitalism, just at the end. I suppose when you ask how I moved from that, if on a personal level, right, like as I'm at pains to say at the beginning of the book, I'm a white middle class person. I got a scholarship to a nice school when I was like 11. So probably had I not been trans, like when I look at like the kind of my classmates at school, they've tended to kind of disappear into society as quite privileged people. And I think there was a kind of combination of things that happened. When I knew that I was different, I deliberately sought out people different from the people that I grew up around. I always sought out people who were in some ways more interesting, living life in a more on the edge way, because I felt like such an outsider, and because I had got the consequent, mental health, chaotic life in my late teens and early 20s that maybe comes from having like a gender variant identity. And I think like a lot of it was organic to me. It was just realizing that I was not going to be quite in the center of things in terms of the sort of kind of social hierarchy, social order. I wouldn't really describe myself personally as like hugely marginalized, but certainly not perhaps going to lead the life that perhaps was expected for me. And then when I started to become like angry about that, annoyed about that, about the inequality, I started to really like have mix more and more in organising and activism and campaigning with people who were much more marginalised than me, trans people who were much more marginalised than me, but also people from other minorities who were much more marginalised than me. And I think a lot of it grew out of like organic friendships and conversations to realise these crossover points between, well, what is affecting me, and then what does that have in common with what's affecting you? And often these are just like very similar systems and ways of looking at the world. So to me, it quite quickly moved out of like me thinking about, well, what would benefit me, to get back to what might have been, like basically what like white middle class public school educated straight men might enjoy. to start to actually critique, well, actually, do you even want what they have, considering it doesn't make many of them very happy, and it's predicated on inequality and, you know, of other people. There's always a disadvantage within a capitalist system. Your benefit comes at someone else's disadvantage. And so for me then I started to move beyond critiquing my lack of equality within the system and thinking more about the system itself and the fact that, like, would you want to be an equal in a society that's already quite corrupt, bound up with systems of domination, power, and is, itself fundamentally unequal.
You said there about feeling angry. I think many trans people at some point feel angry with the world, with society, with family even, with friends. What else would you like to say about what we should do with this anger? Should we suppress it and say, well, that's just an accident of where we are? Or can we use it? Because some trans people, when they get angry, they become what are called activists. Mm-hmm. And then activists are disliked because they're angry and because they're active. Why can't you just quieten down and work it out for yourself? What role do you think anger can play, and what is its place for trans people now?
Yeah, it's when I go back and forth a lot. There's probably different answers depending on at different points in my life. I've probably given very different answers to that question. Anger is a strange thing, right? Because both a very natural, normal human feeling, but we also know it can be quite destructive as well. And I probably felt the full range from trying to suppress my anger and pretending I'm not angry when I am, which can be very toxic, to like fully allowing myself to kind of live through that anger, but it can go to a destructive place. Like sometimes if you're just raging at a system that's not changing, it's that old adage that hating people, getting angry, like being consumed with anger is a bit like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So there has to be, I think, a kind of useful medium in between, which is where you're allowed to feel your anger and to express it, but then from the expression, the next step is to be able to channel it in some way that is positive, and that's what like activist anger is about. I think in activist circles, I don't know if there are any people that are in activist circles in the room, but I don't primarily see myself as an activist. I see myself as a writer, but I have friends who are doing like, lots of grassroots activism. And there's always a risk there that they burn out quite quickly, because often these are subjects people become activists because they're directly affected, whether that's feminist activism, activism around reproductive rights, domestic violence, whether it's anti-racist activism. And that takes its toll on the individual activist, which is why movements have to be collective. And it's about groups of people working together, not this kind of Instagram idea of an activist where you get a few special individuals. Because, if they burn out, then the whole cause could go with them. So it's actually, it's about collective anger. Effective activism, I believe, is about sharing your anger with other people. But it's also about, a group of people can be angry. And then what you do is you allow people space for more complexity of emotion, time to also feel joy, time to also feel like take a step back, time to like recuperate. And I think that's when activism works. I think when it's just one person raging against really violent systems that they often can't change single-handedly, it can take on a bit of a destructive hue. And I think I was a bit like that. I mean, I got involved in trans campaigning really quite early on after coming out. I had different comings out, but like pretty much when I started identifying as trans. But when I look back, there was like a little bit of ego in that too, in that like there's a sense that there's not a lot not going on well in your own life. Maybe your family aren't on board, maybe your friends aren't. And it's kind of this like, well, I'll change society, and I don't want it to be like for other people like it was for me. And that's quite noble, but also it can mean that you get overly egotistical. You start to, maybe not view things apart from what it's doing for you. You don't take on suggestions from other people. You don't listen to advice, all mistakes I've made. So I think there's an importance about while there's space for anger, I think it's good to be in community with other people and to be sharing that kind of with other people in a healthy way. I don't know if that answers the question.
You also write in the book about the Pride movement, about gay liberation, unparalleled with Black Lives Matter. Where do you think we are in terms of the best form of activism for liberation, which has got its celebratory part to it, as well as its campaigning, as well as its element of anger? Where are trans people now in terms of being able to frame ourselves as wanting liberation?
Oh, wow. I think the issue for trans people, I'm speaking within the context, I guess, of the UK specifically, is because of the kind of jarring, violent nature of the backlash, and I mean rhetorically violent, but sometimes physically violent too, of the backlash against trans people's increasing visibility in society, particularly in the media and increasingly in politics, unfortunately. What's happening at the moment is that we're having to fight so much ground even to just maintain the status quo, which isn't that great anyway. We're fighting for what we already have, which is, I won't swear. And so, yeah, so that's the problem. I think is what I wanted to present in the book is this liberation argument. You know, what we're arguing over in media is, for example, the Gender Recognition Act, which is really just about streamlining a process that's already exists. It's still about the state gets to decide if you're a man or a woman. There's no radicalism there. I mean, what are we actually thinking about? Why the state tracks our gender? Why our gender is on every document? Why is your gender on your document? Why, even going beyond I want an F on my passport is well, actually, passports are a part of the violent system of borders that keep that make a distinction between the trans citizen and the trans refugee or the trans asylum seeker, and we're not able to have any of these more radical or expansive conversations because we're just still fighting over about whether or not we have the right gender marker, and that's an intentional strategy sometimes I think of those who oppose us is to keep us arguing about the same stuff, and constantly trans people are constantly presented as new. It's another way in which trans rhetorically trans people are on the back foot sometimes, is that cisgender society, the mainstream society, the media keeps reinventing us we're new, even though trans people in a present form with the label trans have existed for over a century now, and people who've crossed the lines of gender have existed in every recorded human culture. Is if you keep being these people are new, this is a new thing, it's a trend, or there's more, is that actually it keeps trans people again explaining in a very basic, entry level way why we exist. So all of that becomes a little bit of a problem when you talk about liberation, because liberation is much more about expansive and about challenging our entire society and the foundations of which we understand it. And when there's a big moral panic about changing a gender marker on a birth certificate, which literally doesn't affect anything for anyone apart from the person whose birth certificate it is, it becomes much harder. The upside, though, is that if you look at the kind of the mainstream gay movement, as you get more assimilated and you do get more kind of civil rights, and I do, I'm pro getting civil rights. I'm pro we exist in a society as it is now, and I think you should be able to get equality as a stepping stone towards liberation. But as gay people became more assimilated and perhaps became a little, more accepted, certainly in larger and larger pockets of society, a lot of the radicalism disappears from the politics. It all gets a bit comfortable. You could say that trans people, because we're still kind of not there yet, and we're actually kind of still not that palatable to the political mainstream, that presents us with an opportunity to actually continue to embrace radical politics even now. That's very optimistic reading, but I would like to think that, for example, notwithstanding today's news, we lack a lot of mainstream political representation, haven't quite, got quite hostile government. Parliamentary politics isn't really working for trans people, certainly in England at the moment. But then that gives you the opportunity to think, well, what should we be doing in terms of political action? Like if MPs in the kind of very respectable parliamentary process aren't serving us, what does politics look like then?
More and more young people are declaring themselves to be non-binary. Now, throughout history, there have been people who've been just androgynous, and that's the way they were. And today, we might say, these are non-binary people. How much do you think the landscape is going to change for trans people who choose to be trans feminine, trans masculine, by more people insisting that they're neither male nor female?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think to answer that question, you have to look at like the origin of the concept of trans. As I say, it's only been around as the concept that we understand now for about just over 100 years. Like 200 years ago, the concept of a gay person or the concept of a trans person wouldn't make any sense because people didn't talk about your identity. They talked about your behaviour. They talked about like what sex acts you had engaged in, or perhaps what clothes you wore, or how you presented yourself. And obviously 200, 300 years ago, that was really thought of in Christian terms as like sinning or not sinning. And then in the 19th century, you start to get like sexology, which is about like normal and deviant. So, before that, like a heterosexual person even didn't. So heterosexual then becomes the normal. And then there were sexologists in the 19th century tried to classify anything deviant, so homosexuals. And quite quickly, you start to get this category of people who are crossing or doing weird things with gender that aren't normal by these sexologist standards. And then you get the emergence of these terms. So the first one being transsexualismus, from which transsexual comes, and then transvestite. And then from there, you can see a descent down to sort of modern day trans as an umbrella term. And so when the term trans comes to us from people who were not gender radicals, it comes from like people who were basically like treating gender variant people like they were lab rats, and who had a big vested interest in maintaining the gender binary, this idea that there's men, women, and nothing else, and that if you're born with a certain set of genitalia, you're a man. If you're born with another set of genitalia, you're a woman, and like never the twain shall meet. And then there's a softening of, well, there are some people who are crossing these lines, so we'll control the parameters of who can go from male to female, female to male. But we'll say who, we'll say when, we'll say how, we'll say what. And that was what most of the 20th century psychiatry did in terms of creating systems through which a lot of trans people have passed through to access medical care, to change their bodies, or to lead more comfortable lives. And with that came a lot of like crack, basically, about like how stereotypical you should be in performing your new gender role. You should move away, not tell anyone, about your past. You should just disappear back into society. And it makes sense, really, that and what's happened, obviously, is people become more and more confident in saying, well, no, for example, I would say I'm trans and a woman. There's no point where I stop being trans. I'm talking about myself, literally, here. So to me, the two go hand in hand. Like, the type of woman I am is very much a trans woman. It makes sense to me that I think as younger people are becoming more comfortable with these ideas, that it's not about whether or not a psychiatrist says, oh, you've got a medical condition, you're mentally ill, so we're going to let you transition. It sort of makes sense that actually people would question the whole binary at all, and that perhaps there were even people who were considered, who said, oh, I'm trans man, trans woman 30 years ago, who actually, with the discourse and the labels we have now, might say, well, yeah, no, I'm somewhere in the middle, or I'm a bit more fluid than that. But there was no room for that 30 years ago. I mean, if you said that to a psychiatrist, like I'm not a man or a woman, they would be like, get out. So I think younger people are responding to a loosening of binary gender, and that's only a good thing. And I think that's what we're all really fighting for. I mean, I for example, I call myself a trans woman because it's just easier for me in terms of the society in which I live to be like, broadly speaking, if you asked like the men to stand on one side of the room, the women on the other, I would stand with the women. But I think I still try and keep an open mind about what that really means. Would I, in a more liberated future, just want to be a person? What being a woman even means changes with culture and time. There are lots of stereotypes about it that have ceased to exist, fortunately, and will continue to cease to exist, so it's an ever-changing thing. And I think that younger people are just responding to that. And that's a positive thing. I think the odd thing about non-binary identities, and I don't know how familiar people are with the term non-binary, but I think it grew out this term called genderqueer initially, but it's really about, I think the best articulations I've seen about it, and I write about them in the book, is about like refusing categories. It's like a political stance, really, is I don't want to be caught by these two labels. The unfortunate thing is that sometimes, to go to governments and try and say, well, we'd like people to have X on their passports, etc., or when we were working, I used to work at Stonewall, when you'd go to MPs and try and explain to them, they'd be like, I don't understand this non-binary thing, what is it? And it starts to become a bit simplified, then it starts to become a bit reductive, and it almost sounds like it's a third gender, like there's men, women, and then there's a third box, non-binary. Actually, non-binary is a bit more expansive than that. It's not really like a third box. It's more like none of the boxes, or maybe the boxes will change, or maybe the boxes should be got rid of completely. And I think it's good that younger people are embracing that, because it probably means they're less. They've not been told as much by psychiatrists and doctors and cisgender politicians and lawmakers who and what they are. They're actually deciding that on their own terms, which again is only a healthy thing. It's very similar to how there are more and more people identifying as queer or bisexual, because actually the categories are straight or gay, really. There were always people slipping between the two, but if you look in the 80s, it was like, pick a side, you're either gay or straight. And I think to a lot of young people now, that would be more anathema, unfortunately, and it's happening with gender as well. Sorry, really long answer, but it was a good question.
That's fine, you do. It makes me think this conversation takes a fork in the road here. One is the political. Why do we divide people into male and female in the first place? Why do we insist on maintaining the MF marker on so many documents? And it's almost to my mind that the biggest reason to do it is to preserve patriarchy, and I can't think of any other reason to do it. The other fork in the road is about the medicalisation, because as a trans woman, it's like, I desperately need to go down this medical route. And if it means having to meet a fleet of psychiatrists along the way and have to be diagnosed, in my mind, not as something, but as actually there's nothing wrong with you, say we can be trans. But the medicalisation will continue, because even non-binary people might want some clinical route forward in order to resolve their internal difficulties. And it was interesting that there's MP Jamie Wallace today, who came out and said, I've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. I want to be trans. This MP is somewhere on a journey in which I feel they are being steered, both by politics, how on earth do I turn up at the House of Commons once I've made my mind up, but also personally, how do I find my feet in this world when I feel traumatised by what I've experienced so far? So there's a big question of what the medical understanding of requirements for trans and non-binary people might be. Trans people, there's been clear, there's forms of surgery. But what about a future medical route for non-binary people who still have needs?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing on the medical front as well is that even, I just gave that very long answer all about radical smashing of binaries and things like that, but it's very comforting with reference to the MP is that also sometimes transness is so heavily disputed, and people really, a lot of society really, you feel forced to give an origin story, like, I knew when I was 3 years old and I was putting on my mum's shoes or whatever, because you're constantly questioned on it, and you have to have a sense of a good story. in order to satisfy people, that's short and brief. And yeah, going through a medical process can really make you feel, even though I would happily do away with the kind of psychiatric interventions that I had as well. I had to sit down with a gender identity clinician. Like sometimes, I have had things where people will make it sound like you just woke up one day and it was like nothing, and you were declaring yourself a woman. And sometimes you just want to be like, well, no, I've actually been through loads of painful surgery for this. Because it makes it feel like, look, I'm evidencing, like, why would I have done all this stuff? So you buy into the idea that to be medicalized is means you're more real or more valid or all those things. For non-binary people, yeah, it's a difficult one. I think there are, when I was working for Stonewall in Wales, they have a Welsh gender service there, it's a new, because all the, healthcare is devolved in Wales, so it's a devolved thing compared to England. And so they had revamped their medical pathway, and the new clinicians there were very much more engaged with the idea of non-binary people not having to present these really binary narratives. But this all gets into the question of what trans healthcare is for. And so for me, so the trouble is that when you start to reject this pathologizing, it's not a mental illness. The trouble is that some people are like, well, why is it being treated medically at all? For me, it's much richer to say, well, is, for example, hormonal contraception is using hormones to fundamentally hormonally change the body. Why? Because someone doesn't want to become pregnant. Why? Because they want to fulfill their own destiny. Why? Because it would cause them significant distress to have an unwanted pregnancy, and because anyone with uterus, typically women, are not vessels for reproduction. It's about your bodily autonomy under a patriarchy, to be able to set your own course, to be able to determine the course of your life, and not to be bound by the rules about what you should and shouldn't be able to do with your body. And to me, that's a much closer argument for how trans healthcare should be understood, compared to the idea that we're just poor, distressed, mentally ill people who need some kind of help.
I'm sure there'll be some questions on this as well. I hope so. The other thing that comes across through all of the conversations about being trans is about visibility and about presence. In many ways, we don't want to be seen, we don't want to be noticed. But there's a fear in stealth. Because he may be discovered and then be called out for being a fraud. And yet we want to be present in order to show and demonstrate we're just ordinary people, we live ordinary lives, we do the shopping like everybody else, we go to sleep like everybody else, we go to a pub in the evening and visit a show. We're just like everybody else. But we want to be treated right across our lives as just somebody else. But these trans issues stop that being the case, because we're written about in the media, we're discussed about on the news, and dare we hold our heads up high and be known for what we are. Where do you think we're moving in terms of being able to be very ordinarily visible in society without being afraid of being picked up, identified, regarded as other?
I think it's really hard, because the we in your question, it varies a lot. I think it really depends on, it's not the same, for example, for disabled trans people as it is for trans people who are not disabled. It's not the same for white trans people as it is for trans people of colour. If you're a sex worker, it's probably very different to if you're a trans accountant. So there's visibility really is a huge, it's a hugely intersectional question. It really can affect and touch you differently depending on your other characteristics besides your transness. I think, with that said, it's hard to generalise, but I would say, I don't know. I mean, being visible in society, I don't know. I mean, typically trans people's survival and their safety has been dependent on being able to disappear and be invisible, and I'm not sure that that's changed as much as people would like. I mean, I could just on a personal note, in my life, I've got X exponentially easier once I started to blend in more. To the point where I'm not even sure that if I didn't blend in more, I could have done this book or like be doing these sort of public talks. It's very important to me that like when I leave here, I'll be able to get the train and I know I'm not going to be harassed back on the way back to London. And I have friends that either because they're at the start of their transition or because they're gender non-conforming, like they're not intending to pass or blend in or whatever you want to call it. You know, that actually public transport's a nightmare. I have friends who work at nightclubs in London where it's really important that they get a taxi fare part of like they're being on stage or whatever, because they can't remote from that work. So like you're going to hire. So actually, I think to be visibly trans, it really depends on context, but it's certainly not a walk in the park. And I don't think we're at a stage where it's normalised at all. I mean, if you look at like social media as well, I mean, with today's news again with young people, I mean, there's so lot of hostility. And I say that as a visible trans person in public life, there's a lot of open hostility directed your way. You're not completely sure about it. It's not something the rest of life, maybe what gay men are like, gay men are in front of that. I think, visibility is an interesting one. That sounded really down, didn't it? The upside is, I do think trans people being visible and openly trans in their fields is quite an important form of like normalisation. And I do think whilst politics and media have been quite hostile in this country, in the arts and in culture, I do think there are a lot more trans people, and in fashion and stuff like that, there were much more trans people around than when I was growing up. I mean, I always use this example that like Euphoria, the TV show, is like the biggest TV show for like under 25s in the world, really most watched at the moment, teenage show. And it's like, one of the protagonists, one of the main characters, Jules, is a trans woman, who's played by Hunter Schafer, who is a trans woman. And it's a character that's like flawed and, interesting, and not like actually the transness is done quite subtly. And that's so different to like, I'm not old, but like when I was growing up, there was nothing like that. Like it was literally only in the tabloids, or maybe Big Brother, Nadia, Big Brother, back in the day, who was a positive light, but she got a real hell of a time too. So actually, visibility still is important in culture and the arts. I think it's really important for young people coming out now. So I'm not completely anti or pessimistic about the benefits and the strides that trans people have made in visibility, but I am a little bit critical of the idea that being visible is always a good thing, it's always a safe thing, and that being visible means that like you win acceptance or understanding from people, because sometimes in certain contexts that's not the case.
Yeah, certainly I hope that if I achieve nothing else in this latter part of my life, it is that I am present, I'm around, I'm ordinary, and people know that I'm trans, and they think, hey, so what? And if that's what I do, that's good. But now you've written a book which covers all the ground of all that's happening, the ups and downs of the last decade, and is optimistic. Who do you most want to read and be affected by this book?
I mean, so far it's only been out 7 months, but the people where I've been I've had like great, like it's been really lovely, but the amount of tags I get a day on social media, and people DMing me, like to the point where I can't even like respond to them all anymore. Like, that's not like a humble brag, it's just like, in case anyone's like, that's not my message, I just never looked at it. But the people where I've been like most like, oh, that's really good, is I don't know, like one older, people who say their dad read it, and I mean specifically like middle-aged straight men, and I hope that's not to like, but it's like that, because I think we know that like because of the debate within feminism that like perhaps cisgender women are more likely to be engaged in this topic, or have friends who are talking about it, or know, or isn't there this argument between feminists about it. Whereas I often feel like particularly white, like middle-aged straight men, like they sort of drift in the background on this, and often actually we know that like that's a group of people that wield the most institutional power. That's actually the group, if you look at polling, who are actually the most transphobic. So I'm always really pleased when it's like, from a demographic like that, who often go silent or like unseen in terms of what their views are until they're polled and it's bad. And the other is, of course, and I've had messages from people who's basically said that they were entertaining, they're not going to be fully radicalised into it, but perhaps were entertaining gender critical views, or they had a family member who was entertaining gender critical views, by which it means that they found some of the talking points quite convincing, or they weren't satisfied about the answers, or they were perhaps like, it's not like it was the thing that consumed them, but they certainly had sympathy with some of the arguments that they'd read, and have said that, they've read the book and it shifted their position. They might not have agreed with them in full, but it shifted their position to a more pro-trans standpoint. Really, that's like the people that you want to get. I'm holding myself out as a persuasive writer. As nice as it is, obviously I cared about what trans people thought about it. Like I was nervous about that. But yeah, I mean, it's nice to get, like, obviously pro-trans, nice people, basically the kinds of people who'd be my friends, like liberal gay people, liberal women. Like, obviously I'm glad that the book is for them to have like the full arguments and the full, to understand the topic better. But it is like, it's a persuasive book. Like, the best is when it can be pulling someone who's already on their way to being a bit lost.
I would agree with you on that. It's certainly persuasive, and it's deep enough, I think, to have a long life. And when all these people have bought it and read it as well, then so much the better. But we've reached that wonderful time of the evening when we want to know what you want to ask, what you want to know, what you want to probe from Shon. So, do we have a roving mic, or do you want to?
I think we might just have to say it loud, or say it to me because I am loud. So yeah, has anyone got any questions we'd like to put to Shon or Andy?
I'm Jane. I just want to say thanks for the book. I've read it, and fantastic. One thing that I'm a little bit worried about is sort of the infighting within the LGBT community, especially with the LGB side against trans people.
Yeah.
Do you think that's something that we should be worried about, or is it actually much smaller numbers? Like, where do you think that situation going forward?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, like, yes, it does concern me, because I think it's like a very intentional way to kind of create a distraction, so that we're so busy invested in that we're not perhaps doing the work that the LGBT Alliance Coalition has always done, which is actually about like pushing back against usually the far right and the right wing, who are going to probably try and take all of our rights. Like, that's what it's intended to do, is to distract us. And actually, as you said, you've read the book. Like, in the book, I sort of talk about, particularly the Christian right in the US, about how they're aware that trans people are like the smallest group within, say, the four letters LGBT, and so like, yeah, causing one part to turn on the other. It's a deliberate tactic. On the other hand, I mean, I'm not too concerned about it. Like, they had that like really awful lesbian and gay news. It was like, we're going to just do news for lesbians and gays, and then like, every story was about trans people, like a negative one. Yeah, turns out it's folded because no one wants to read it. And actually, even they said in their closing statement, like, the trouble is that there was like so few of us. And yeah, I think they are small numbers. It's a really small minority, but disproportionately loud. It's the same thing as within feminism. And I think they'll dwindle. I think one of the benefits of like the LGBT Alliance popping up and these various, the counter protest at Pride in 2018 in London, is I think it's been really good that LGBT people, I think there's more they could do, but they have become much more vocal in support of trans people in recent years. Like, I think it's no surprise to anyone that might know about my career or life. I identified as a gay man before I transitioned. And I remember, like, when I was, like, going out on the gay scene when I was, like, in my late teens and early 20s, like, I mean, gay men were quite transphobic without even realising. I probably was, like, using language that I don't know anyone that would use it now, quite ignorant, even, unintentionally about trans people. And I do think there's been a shift. Again, there's a bit of a generational divide, but like I do think people are much more alive to the need to make the LGBTQ plus community spaces more inclusive of trans people. I don't think LGBT people particularly, cis LGBT people should rest on their laurels there, because obviously the backlash against trans people is only growing. But yeah, so I guess to answer your question in short, I'm not too worried about it, but I think it's something to be like vigilant about. And I think it's like more about I much prefer when people kind of get off Twitter and argue with each other on Twitter and do stuff like at prides or in community spaces. Do you know what I mean? Like, how inclusive is the like space that you've actually got influence over for trans people, more than like, are you having a go at like gender critical people on Twitter?
Another question? Thank you very much for your thoughts, and thank you, Andy, for guiding it through this conversation. I'm actually a old age, almost a straight man. But you referred to it in your answer there briefly about, I'm a Christian as well. I'd just like to know what your views are, whether you mentioned in your book, I'm not sure, about, is it possible to be trans and a practicing Christian today? Or is that irrelevant to you?
It's not in the book, but it's very possible to be trans. Actually, I knew in Wales, when I worked for Stonewall Cymru, I knew the Reverend Sarah Jones, who is a trans vicar. She was a Catholic priest and then transitioned, and then, well, it's funny because when you change from the Catholic Church to the Anglican Church, it's also called a transition. She gender transitioned, she denominationally transitioned. I think there are increasingly like numbers of trans people of faith. Where the Christian right, I mean, is in the US, is specifically like the evangelical churches who have, like, since the Reagan era, have a very fundamentalist form of Christianity that's kind of combined with like right-wing economic conservatism, and they tend to focus on the death penalty, abortion, LGBT people, and nothing else. It's just about, it's a very patriarchal interpretation of what Christianity is about, I would say. And so when I mentioned the Christian right, it's that specific iteration or Christian justification for right-wing views of Christianity, like much like feminism. Christianity obviously is a very broad church, and there are hugely different interpretations of it. But I think there are increasingly numbers of LGBTQ plus people of faith and trans people of faith in society. Including me. I think that's a growing conversation that LGBT organisations like Stonewall, because I think for several years LGBT people in churches had a kind of hostile relationship where a lot of LGBT people felt they had been treated badly by churches, and there was perhaps more in traditional churches hostility towards LGBT people. But I think we're evolving that conversation now to recognise that, and not just churches, queer and trans Muslims, people of all faiths really, who their faith is still important to them, and if they can find a way for that to coexist with their LGBTQ plus identity, then really we shouldn't be getting hostility from either side from their faith community or the faith community. I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I ask a question? I'm a playwright, so if I want to put a transgender character in a play, I've actually done a short film on a transgender person, but anyway, so if I want to do this in a play, but I don't want to tell all their story, how would you suggest that I actually put them on the stage?
In terms of who plays them?
Well, in how they dress, how they play, their sexuality.
Well, I mean, it depends. Like, trans people can vary a lot in their presentation, their sexuality, and everything. I think it would be. It's just about making sure that you portray them consistently with how the character is at that time. But in terms of their sexuality, it depends what their sexuality is.
Well, could you tell me? Could you explain to me more about transgender sexuality?
Okay. Well, trans people, like everyone else, have a sexuality typically, unless they're asexual. And trans people can be attracted. I mean, like you can get straight trans people, gay trans people, trans lesbians. So it really varies. It depends on whether, just as if you were writing a non-trans character, it would depend on whether you wanted that character to be a woman attracted to women, a woman attracted to men. You know, it would vary. It's pretty much like trans people being people.
Right.
Okay, is there any other questions? Thank you, got one again. Thank you.
You were talking earlier about activism and talking about visibility. And I'm the mother of a trans daughter, and I very much like to be active and support in a more public way, but I'm quite anxious about being the attention to my family. And I wonder about your views about who is active supporting trans people, because I mean I'm not on Twitter and I'm not really sure how many people like me are fighting for rights, and it strikes me that there should be thousands of us with a voice, always people on the wait list and in referrals just to the trans hospital every month for 400, 500 people, young adults.
Yeah.
So where are we, and why aren't we a massive campaign attack and doing something? Like I want to, I don't know how to, I don't know what your views are on that.
Yeah, well, I think your question kind of contained its own answer, which is that the people are anxious. So in the book, the first chapter opens with a trans girl who is primary school age at the time I spoke to her, and she socially transitioned. She started to sort of say she had a female gender identity very young, and even like sort of getting an interview with that family, it was because I was a trans author, because I had some contact with them before, building that trust. Why? Because they were really nervous about putting themselves out there, and obviously I changed their names and identities in the book for that reason. And it was, even with me, who was like a fellow trans person, they were a bit nervous, and that's completely understandable. I think a lot of people don't have the time, energy, or resources, particularly if you've got someone in your family who you're trying to support through a coming out transition process. So you have to focus on, you have to focus on yourself and your family and your own life at that time. And yeah, not everyone wants, especially when it's young people involved, they don't necessarily want, what they want from their parents is not necessarily like a strident marcher. It's like someone that's going to listen to them or support them or advocate for them in medical settings, and that's a huge, as you I'm sure know, the medical pathway, particularly for young people, is just, it's designed almost to kind of drain you and you have to really keep on pushing to get treated seriously at all. And so I think that just saps at people's energy, which is why there wasn't this huge visible movement of families. That combined with media hostility and fear of stigma, and the fact that it's young people, and that often young people are entitled to privacy, so I guess that's probably why. And I would just say to you, I don't know much about you or your situation, but in terms of activism, it doesn't always, again, it's that visibility thing, it doesn't always have to be visible. There are lots of things that can be, in terms of support, that can be done, whether that's donating to organisations like Gendered Intelligence that run youth camps for young trans people so that they can meet other people like them, or fundraising for them, or there's a whole that's just off the top of my head, but I think there are lots of slightly lower key ways that make just as much of a material contribution as becoming, you don't have to necessarily be putting yourself out there in a really visible way. I don't know if that helps. Again, it's just off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, it does. It's just really kind of frustrating, though, isn't it? That nothing's happening, and you should be doing something, could be doing something.
Yeah, it's interesting that working in the media, in journalism, in traditional newspapers, I'm not going to name any names, but say a broadsheet that's known for its liberal views, but it's really transphobic. It's interesting that at those organisations that I have previously worked with, that a lot of the internal changes are happening less because they're hiring any trans people, but because people who work there are having trans people come out in their families. it's interesting to see those shifts in attitudes when people start to realise. So I think that there are ways in which people do change in their own atmosphere. I think it with myself. My mum is a social worker, so is my sister. My family is social workers too, both with children and young people. And I do always think, because they're very obviously very informed and very right on in many ways about trans people in a profession where like social workers are getting very used to the fact that more and more young people are coming out as trans and feel like, if they did their training 20 years ago, they don't really understand it. But I do often think, if I hadn't been trans, like, well, what would my mum's views of this be? So like, even utilising the knowledge you have from your own experience in professional, so any sphere of influence is still, maybe not activism, but it's still making a positive contribution in a way that, yes, is paying forward, I guess, the experience.
How old is your daughter?
20.
On the spot.
Any other questions?
Yeah. You've spoken briefly about the different ways trans people are represented in the media. I was wondering if you could sort of maybe give us your views on. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words.
Don't worry.
Maybe give us some views how people under the trans umbrella, like I myself, I'm one of the young non-binary people you spoke about, how they should sort of, or could sort of see themselves not meeting that media stereotypical view. So for example, I myself dress very femme, and as such, frequently misgendered. But I'm sure that under the trans umbrella, people have the same struggle all the time.
Yeah, I mean I mean you would probably have a sense of it better than me, right? But I think just from the non-binary people I know in my own life, I guess there is that difficulty, is that it's even more challenging to people's assumptions. I do sort of feel like, to a certain extent, like even it's like I do mention in the book the example of like Piers Morgan, like the worst example for now, but whatever. It is that like someone like he sort of gets someone like me. Because it like makes sense to him, but then he's like really was, particularly when he was on Good Morning Britain, just so dismissive of non-binary identities, and that's like a different struggle. The one that I guess I have a degree of like, whether you call it privilege or like I'm just more legible to people. And yeah, so in terms of the media representation, I feel like the struggle there, I don't know if you would agree, is the stereotypes now of like non-binary people is that it's trendy, or that they're constantly having to talk about their gender. You have to constantly, like, there's no way you can do anything in media without being like, I use they, them pronouns, it's a singular, this is what non-binary means. And I feel like the next step really is that we'll just say this isn't, this person's non-binary. I mean, when I write about, like, when I'm writing about arts or culture, nothing to do with the book, when I was writing about art salon, there'd be non-binary artists. I just think that I used to always just be like, I'm just going to use the they, them pronoun. I'm not even going to say who identifies as non-binary and uses they, them, because really you're there to talk about their art, for example. And I feel like that should be the standard that the whole media is at, because it's really about, if obviously if the person wants to talk about it, then fine. But I feel like a lot of non-binary people, the closer they get to the mainstream media, the more that they just feel like, I can't be bothered with this, I can't be bothered to do the gender 101 again. I don't know if that's how you see it. And so for me, the next step seems to be to at least be cutting out the gender 101, just as the same for like, whether people who like, trans men and trans women who medically transitioned, is that like, the step was to stop having to tell people whether or not you were going to have surgery, you've had surgery, what surgeries you've had. Similarly, I think this kind of like focus on pronouns and like having to explain it and making people sound really fussy, and that like all non-binary people are trying to trip you up. I just feel like everyone could chill out about that and then allow people to be visibly non-binary but getting on with it in other ways. That's for me what the next step would be. And that's what I've always tried to do as a journalist when I've been working with non-binary people who are trying to talk about something else.
Got time for one more question.
So you mentioned earlier about like the LGBT Alliance and the GC movement, and I kind of just wonder, I always think to myself, how long is it going to take for those movements to die out or at least quieten down? Because at the current time they're really down and it's quite damaging.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think what will. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a certain answer on that because they've only gotten bigger. I mean, I think the positive thing there is that, you know, I really want to avoid. I'm always worried about being tripped up and like basically coming across as ageist and not ageist, but obviously there is a generational divide just because trans people are more visible for people who are millennials or younger. And I think that's reflected in who is more sympathetic or whose first word, like the first word they hear on trans people is gender critical stuff, it's misinformation. And that does tend to be, it tends to be an older demographic, which means that they're not really recruiting younger members. And I know that's not much consolation, but there is an advantage there that people retire. I've been thinking about that a lot in the media. Or the editors and columnists. I think realistically it will be something like a slow decline. I think what we're seeing is that I think, you know, when you look again at younger people, younger feminists, there just is less tolerance for gender critical, well, they wouldn't even call it gender critical, they call it transphobic, but gender critical is already a concession to how they call themselves, is that there is less tolerance for transphobic talking points in younger circles, in queerer circles. And I think what will gradually happen is it will just become like more and more unacceptable to express, and I think the ones who are die hard will end up finding themselves quite like they just automatically become conservative, so they become right wing. They can no longer really claim to be like a liberal left wing feminist anymore when you're really saying the same things as Putin. So I think what will happen is that they'll be around more, but I think that they'll continue to be around, but there will be less spheres of influence for them to do damage. No, that's wrong. Whatever, for them to do damage in. They'll have less spheres of influence. The problem at the moment is that it's a small group of people, but they have disproportionate influence, particularly in traditional media, the broadsheets. The Daily Mail, the Times, the Murdoch media, and unfortunately, because we have a very right-wing government at the moment that's very interested in the culture war, they're getting more and more of an airtime. But I think that will change. I think again, liberal newspapers, still quite transphobic, kind of find that they're. You know, that if they're going to stay alive, but also print media is dying, which I'm delighted about, to be honest. Print media is dying out, and so a lot of these transphobic publications, frankly, won't exist in 20 years. And the ones that want to stay alive are realising they're going to have to engage with younger readerships, and again, I think there's less of a tolerance. So I guess the short answer there is that I think it will gradually wane, but it will be a gradual waning. And in the meantime, I feel like people should really just block everyone on Twitter that saying that we can talking points, it's just not worth engaging, they're only amplifying.
So the message is to hang in there. Buy the book, buy copies for your local MPs, your friends, and then maybe we'll have a better future as a result. Thank you very much, Shon.
Thank you.
Big thank you for Andy as well. You've all got feedback forms on your tables. If you've enjoyed the event and you want some more things like this, please fill out the feedback forms, because it's this sort of thing that goes to. Because you're not filming, are you? Stop filming.